James Bond, a franchise with a combined $12 billion box office over its almost 60-year run. To say it's a big deal is a bit of an understatement. Everyone knows about 007. He's cool, he's a spy who always saves the day and gets the girl. He likes his martini shaken and not stirred. This spy has been ingrained in pop culture. He's referenced, spoofed, mimicked, and has come to symbolize everything suave and masculine from the Cold War era of espionage. With the new Bond film in indefinite release limbo, I've been going through a bit of a withdrawal. Skyfall was the film that brought me into the franchise, and I'm always looking forward to the next installment. What better time to watch every James Bond movie? I'm going through every single film and giving you the high and low of them so you don't have to waste $100 renting them like I did. This is how I'm rating these 24 movies. I'm rating these movies in 4 different categories. Let the record state that I am not rating them by their filmic qualities or how they would rank in the year that they were created. I could have, but I felt like enjoying myself and not really going back to film school, so this is also not a comparison to any of the novels. My first rating category is the overall story and enjoyment. My second category is social awareness, so how much problematic content is there by today's standards? I definitely think that you can separate your enjoyment of something and the issues within them. Just don't overlook them. You should address them for what they are. Third is the intro sequence, so how good are the song and the visuals combined? And lastly, should you want to take a dip into the series past, either skip it or watch it. Another note, I did not watch the 2 non-Eon films, for all of you who might point that out in the comments. So with all that being said, let's do this. First up is Dr. No. 007 is sent to Jamaica to investigate the death of 2 British operatives and finds that the Chinese are dabbling in weaponizing radio or radioactivity or something like that. This is a great introduction to the series. It tells you everything you need to know about 007 in the Cold War political climate of the 60s and sets the air for the rest of the series. There are 2 yellow-faced characters, Miss Taro played by Zena Marshall and Dr. No played by Joseph Wiseman. But if you can take that as a product of the time, it's an awesome example of where the genre stood in the 60s. Thoroughly enjoyable. From Russia with Love. 007 goes into a trap set by Russia in Istanbul, entangling him with Tatiana Romanova as he investigates exactly where the trap leads back to. This installment has a compelling Cold War era scenario with even more action. It's a really strong second installment that's actually more memorable than the first. There's intrigue inherently mixed with a romance that gives this film a nostalgic kind of air. Fight sequences are genuinely impressive for the time, and they do their best to show the brute strength of Bond's adversary. It's a quintessential 60s spy movie with a hot chick fight for some reason. Also, there's a toddler on a leash. Goldfinger. 007 follows Goldfinger's trail to discover a plot backed by the Chinese to destroy the economies of the US and Great Britain by radiating all of the golden Fort Knox. This is another typical Cold War plot, but it felt like there was a definite push in this installment to be raunchier and a bit more crass with 007's character. It puts further definition on him as this alpha male character that brandishes his sexuality and his nose for danger endlessly. This is the height of tensions post-war between the East and the West, and there was probably a pretty big fear of Westerners even helping to further the plot of the communists. There's this scene.
Say goodbye to Felix. Man talk.
This exotic bodyguard who is absolutely not scary in any way, and a smart pilot named
Pussy Galore,
who of course falls for our hero. Surprise. I had a bit of a harder time keeping interest in this one. The intro song honestly is stronger than most of the movie. Seriously, the song slaps. Thunderball. After 2 atom bombs are stolen, 007 travels to Nassau to investigate a man named Largo for his involvement with the bombs and his role with Spectre. This one lost the plot in the start, but the plot just ended up being the age-old tale of the world's overlords trying to use an atom bomb to destroy a city for no justifiable reason. The setting felt like the perfect excuse to break out the underwater camera rig. Every woman that spoke looked exactly the same. The ASPCA was also definitely not a part of this production. So if you don't want to see real sharks getting harpooned, I suggest you skip it. Also, what was up with the 60s and belly dancers shaking their titties? We're 3 for 4 on that one now. You Only Live Twice. 007 travels to Japan after some trouble in space and finds Spectre trying to stoke the fire between the US and USSR by stealing spacecraft from each country. Commies in space! The classic tale. The Orientalism in this one is real. All the West seems to know about Japan as sumo, geishas, swords, and ninjas. So not much has changed. This movie keeps up the trend of a good girl being in a bad situation. James can change their ways seemingly through some time in the sheets. Sex, after all, is the primary weapon of espionage.
What's a nice girl like you doing in a place like this?
There's also some gross dialogue about women being possessions and Japanese women specifically being more subservient than Western women. Despite all of the socially problematic things, I actually really enjoyed this one. It was engaging and told an interesting story that said a lot about the political fears of the time. The set and costume design was especially good in this one. On Her Majesty's Secret Service, 007 falls onto the trail of Blofeld, who's planning to threaten governments with biological weapons, aka hot girls who will destroy humanity's chance of reproduction just by having sex. George Lazenby had only one installment in this series due to some bad career advice and supposedly being an asshole on set, but I feel like it was the best film of the 60s. It was a bold step into the new turn of the decade style, and it felt like the start of a more sophisticated Bond film, a little bit darker and a little bit deeper. We get a small amount of personal background on Bond, his family coat of arms with the motto, "The world is not enough." And in the end, he gets married to Tracy, who is killed not even 5 minutes later. Besides the troubling father owning the daughter stuff, it's a seriously compelling story. I recommend it. Diamonds Are Forever. 007 is on the trail of Blofeld once again and travels to Las Vegas to investigate missing diamonds and their function and the big bad's plot for world domination. This one was cheesier and campier than ever before, which is a shame after the progression of the previous film. The girls are ditzier, the plot gets muddy and lost. I've really got nothing much to say about this one. Live and Let Die. 007 follows the trail of a heroin-growing criminal and finds himself entrenched in a world of voodoo and the occult, and all those other things that black people love to dabble in. Am I right? So much exoticism, so many Black Sabbath tropes. I went into this movie knowing there would be some racism involved based on just the times, but the more I thought about it, the worse it got. The story isn't bad, but it's diminished not just by that, but also by the fact that it felt more hollow than the last without Blofeld or Spectre present, when they had been centerpieces for the past 4 films. The theme song is bomb, though. The Man with the Golden Gun. 007 follows a taunt from an international assassin to find out more of his business, which has something to do with selling solar energy to the highest bidder or something like that, and tries to get him killed before he gets killed. The gun is a metaphor for a dick. Wow. This one wasn't good and wasn't bad. James travels all over Southeast Asia to track our villain down where he finds more martial arts, because what's Asia without it? A flying car, and a fun house in this guy's basement, which isn't weird at all. What makes Scaramanga interesting is that he compares himself to James, saying they're two sides of the same coin. They're both assassins, they both kill, just with different motives. But this is the 70s, so of course our hero doesn't stumble over the implications. The Spy Who Loved Me. 007 must team up with a Russian spy after both countries get nuclear submarines stolen by a common enemy, aka kind of the same plot as You Only Live Twice. This film came out when the tensions of the Cold War weren't quite as high. The peace movement was in full swing, and perhaps that's what inspired this super spy partnership. James and Soviet agent XXX, could you tell that she's a woman, have to work together to solve the mystery. The 70s vibe in the soundtrack is real. Having a Soviet analog to 007's character would have been so much more interesting if she had been treated as an agent first and a woman second. But of course she's the love interest who has to be captured while the men save the day in the end, not to mention being put into something sexy just for her rescue. Also, Jaws is here. Moonraker. After a space shuttle is stolen from both the US and USSR, 007 teams up with a CIA agent to get down to the bottom of the disappearance. And Jaws is back. Also, spies in space. This film was definitely riding the Star Wars wave hard. It happens to be the exact same premise of The Spy Who Loved Me, just reskinned. Instead of conquering the ocean, the villain just wants to conquer space. Dr. Goodhead, what a name, is the CIA agent that James has to team up with. But she's a little bit more of a respected character. She doesn't have any moments of revealing clothing, sticking to pantsuits. Very modern. What can I tell you about this one? There's a full space station that somehow no one in the world notices while it's being constructed. There's laser guns. Jaws gets a girlfriend and then they get blown up together on said space station. It's not a great movie, but if you're interested in the time period, it's worth a watch. For your eyes only. 007 must retrieve a weapon system on board a sunken British spy vessel, but he's racing against time as other parties gain interest in nabbing it first. What an awesome jump into the 80s. With the opening shot of Teresa's grave, she and Bond were married if you can't remember, and a lack of Blofeld. It felt a bit like this series was saying goodbye to the 60s and 70s and saying hello to the 80s. Our Bond girl Melina has her own motives and backstory that we actually see on screen, and Bond treats her differently than previous girls. This movie was a good return to realism from the campiness of the 70s. People acted how real people might actually act in their circumstances, and it was incredibly refreshing. Octopussy. One trigger-happy USSR general wants to blow up some city using Russian crown jewels as a cover or something like that. And we're back to camp. This movie lacked coherency through and through. It was just messy. You've got this lady assassin with an island of other lady assassins that of course fight in bikinis. But they feel like they have nothing to do with the actual plotline of the film. The motives of the main bad guy aren't interesting. A USSR general who goes against orders to try and relive great wars and restore honor to the country. But his methods are confusing and get clouded up with everything else. A View to Kill. 007 investigates a psychopath Nazi experiment science baby who's planning on destroying Silicon Valley to get the market on electronics. We are balls deep in the 80s with this one. We've got Neon, we've got Duran Duran, we've got a young psychopathic Yeppy, we've got Grace Jones. There was something missing or different in this one compared to previous 007 films though. It felt more like a generic action movie than a James Bond film. There was a definite push to attract a younger generation to this series, and that push was a little bit too heavy-handed. One of the interesting things about the Bond films is the grand scale of their villains and their elegance and their seamless plots. In the end, our Christopher Walken Nazi baby is just gunning down tons of mine workers. That being said, this was not a great way for Roger Moore to exit the series. The Living Daylights. After a KGB defector goes missing, 007 follows his trail to an American war fanboy trying to turn a profit with the Russians with an illegal arms deal. This is an awesome introduction of Timothy Dalton as well as a new era of Bond. The situation he finds himself in is highly contemporary and felt like a much more realistic scope of a mission. This was a fitting start for the transition into a more modern film series. This is the first time we see one of 007's colleagues killed in action, and his reaction in turn. It shows that he has a much larger emotional compulsion and motive in his work than we've ever seen before. In the past films, he would occasionally get emotional over a woman's love or betrayal, but it was always more about his ego than his feelings towards that woman. We also see him developing an actual attachment for our Bond girl, Cara Milvoy. This is a Bond that stays classy, but actually has some kind of depth behind the suits and the guns. License to Kill. There's a drug lord that has to be stopped. That's it. That's the plot. I don't have much to say about this one. The most interesting bit is seeing a more emotionally invested 007 in the iguana with the diamond collar. GoldenEye. After an EMP weapon is stolen and destroys a USSR satellite, 007 investigates and finds the past coming back to threaten the future. After a whole bunch of legal acquisitions and lawsuits, 6 years pass between GoldenEye and License to Kill. We've got a new Bond and a new direction for this series that goes off with a bang. Nothing says it better than this scene with Judi Dench's M.
Because I think you're a sexist, misogynist dinosaur. A relic of the Cold War. Whose boyish charms, though wasted on me, obviously appeal to that young woman I sent out to evaluate you.
Point taken.
This monologue alone says everything that needs to be said about the reboot. Gone are the days of sexy women lying around the pool or hanging around an island all for Bond's pleasure. The series takes a more dramatic and serious turn into the world of spies. Death, betrayal, and morality. This movie has more symbolism than we've ever seen before. James has to literally confront ruins of the past and the consequences of both personal and national history, personified in his friend Alec. This is probably not a great one to watch with the whole family if you don't want to experience a lady villain that gets off on killing all these men. We don't have time to unpack all the aspects of the male gaze going on there. Tomorrow Never Dies. This is the same setup as The Spy Who Loved Me, and Moonraker, and You Only Live Twice. A media mogul is causing news headlines himself, and 007 works to take him down before an international incident occurs. This is another really good contemporary story. It's 24 years old, but it could still be a completely current plotline. Who writes the news? Who creates it? What's the overlap of interest? This installment is more high-tech, and the intro sequence is something that could go straight into Cyberpunk 2077. There's a specific emphasis in this film about Bond and his personal causes and effects, the carnage he leaves behind and those left dead in his wake. Bonus points for Michelle Yeoh being a Bond girl, even if she does fight at one point in ridiculous 6-inch heels. The World Is Not Enough. As a personal favor for M, 007 is sent as a bodyguard for Elektra King, an heiress of an oil dynasty working to complete a pipeline to the west. Things get complicated. This one was not good and not bad. Having a female villain for the first time and a twist like that could have been more interesting. Something was missing that made this installment a little lackluster. What makes this movie a little more interesting is that we're dealing with M's past this time. King is the daughter of a close friend of hers, and she holds guilt for his death and Elektra's capture at one point. They did the women in this movie pretty dirty. There's an oh-so-casual mention of Stockholm Syndrome when tensions are high, as if every woman naturally falls in love with her abuser. Spoiler alert, it's not very casual. We meet our other leading woman, Christmas Jones, working as a nuclear physicist out in the field. The first comment about her is, she's not interested in men, so don't bother. Because she's only there to be a catch, obviously not to do her job. Again, we don't have time to go into the layers of the male gaze in that ending torture scene. Die Another Day. 007 travels to North Korea to take down General Tan Sun Moon for an arms deal using diamonds as payment, but he is captured and tortured after supposedly killing the general. Surprise, he survived. On another note, a millionaire has popped up in England with a fortune in diamonds. There's also a space laser. Where to begin with this mess? From the start of the intro sequence and that awful Madonna song, this movie does not slow down, and not in a good way. I wanted it to be good just because it had Halle Berry in it, but unfortunately not. This film felt like Moonraker in that it tried too hard to be a genre that it wasn't. It was obviously trying to cash in on the turn of the millennium Matrix-style vibe, but failed with poor CGI, cheesy editing, and a convoluted plot. There's something that feels so very off about General Moon changing race, then returning to North Korean uniform. Did they really not want to cast that many East Asians for the entirety of this film? It feels a little bit too close to a Red Scare film trope. Beware, the enemy communists could be wearing your skin and hiding right under your nose. Casino Royale. 007 tracks Le Chiffre, an accountant and gambler that holds money for terrorist groups. There's a lot of card games that you don't actually have to understand to know what's going on. Yay! We've focused on a new direction for Bond in the best way possible. Casino Royale is Daniel Craig's debut that takes the concept of the Brosnan debut and aces it with flying colors. In fact, it even acts as another reboot in and of itself. It feels like the first film in this franchise where 007 actually goes through a character arc. We see 007 as a new agent, only having just gotten his license to kill before the film begins. He's rash and egotistical and a blunt instrument that is slowly sharpened into something a little more refined by the end of the film. Though Vesper is only there to be at Bond's side and further his plot, she still gives interesting insight into James's character. She's not of the same world James is. After violence at the casino, we see how the two characters react. He drinks and she breaks down. She shows places where he's too rash and where his ego lingers. When he falls for her, he's ready to give it all up until her tragic end. And after that, he shuts down and gets right back to business. If you want a movie with more substance, this is it. Quantum of Solace. Following on the heels of Casino Royale, James follows the path to Vesper's ex for vengeance and finds corruption in Bolivia that needs some correction. Whereas ego was the major stumbling block of the last film, anger and rash violence are 007 stumbling blocks in this film. Our main villain is a capitalist who funds coups and imposes monopolies on natural resources. Wow, never heard of that one before. The concept of ecological warfare is a new one for this series and quite interesting, but there was something in this film that was missing for me that didn't quite get to where it had the potential to go to. Another interesting point of this movie is Camille Montez. Even though she's a Bolivian character played by a definitely not Bolivian actress, she isn't a Bond girl that becomes romantically involved with him. She's out for her own revenge, so she keeps showing up throughout the story. Bond in turn takes her under his wing. He understands the anger because he's searching for that same revenge. Skyfall. After an attack on MI6, 007 follows the trail of Raul Silva to bring him to justice and finds himself out of his depth as the past comes back to haunt them all. This is the height of this series since its reboot, hands down. I could probably do an entire video essay on this movie alone. Dealing with aging and obsolescence, James and MI6 struggle to keep up with an enemy that always seems to be one step ahead. Silva is M's personal ghost, an agent that fell to corruption and blames her personally for his pain and abandonment. This film brings back Q and Moneypenny, who have been absent from the last two films, and does so in a spectacular fashion. Moneypenny goes through her own arc, starting as a field agent and dealing with the personal mental consequences of a mistake in the field before landing in her traditional role in the franchise. Q is an interesting counterpoint to 007 in this film. When James is already having to deal with his own aging, he meets a new quartermaster that's possibly half his age, who brings MI6 into the digital era to give them a chance to understand and defeat their enemy. Since the beginning of this series, we've only learned 2 pieces of personal information about James Bond. His family motto on their crest is "The world is not enough," and James was an orphan. This film dives into his personal history while intertwining his relationship with both M and MI6. Spectre. In the aftermath of Skyfall, MI6 deals with the danger of a decision to shut down the 00 program, while Bond follows the trail of a dead man to find an old face that means trouble. Following up Skyfall with some of the same themes of obsolescence and the enemy within the system, Spectre feels like it tries to do what Skyfall already did, but in a way that's less memorable. I've watched this movie 4 or 5 times in the past, but I still had to do a rewatch just to write this. This is basically what happens. The British government wants to consider spies a thing of the past and bring a new age of technological relevance that, surprise, is actually being controlled by a super secret society that, surprise, can be traced back to everyone that James has ever faced so far. And it just so happens to be run by someone from Bond's past that should by all means be dead. Also, Dr. Madeline Swan is there for some reason that doesn't really add much to this film but a forced romance. She could have been such an interesting addition, but instead she's property passed from her father's protection to James's and simply gets toted around the entire film. The most interesting thing about the film is how it shows how Craig's Bond has changed since his start in the franchise as a new agent. In the end, he makes the decision not to kill Blofeld, even when the man claims to be the source of all of the pain and death in his life. The same man that started off his career by blowing through an embassy with no hesitation whatsoever. He's grown and learned lessons about who to trust and when not to pull the trigger. For almost 60 years, the Bond film series has been able to stay relevant and popular to generations of audiences, and it has the spy genre to thank for that. Through the decades, you can see what political events inspired their villains and their plots, and what the fears of the people were for 007 to solve. This is most noticeable in the 60s during the height of the Red Scare, and in the 2000s with the rise of cyber warfare. Watching through this series from start to finish was such a fun way to travel through history. You can see fashions come and go, watch film technology improve bit by bit, and see really just how far we've come in popular media. But in case you don't want to watch them all yourself, here's the final breakdown of how all 24 movies compare.